Want to bet? You can do it at Sports Interaction, Canada Sportsbook. Football is back, baseball playoffs, and the hockey season are around the corner. Bet pregame, live in play, or on one of our many prop bets. Made for Canadians, by Canadians, Sports Interaction makes it easy to deposit, play, and cash out. Join now and see all sports betting has to offer. You can head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN. That's sportsinteraction.com/SDPN. Ontario only, 19 plus. Please play responsibly. I just want to ask about, just because you're covering it, Leafs training camp and the goalie situation. How is it with Matt Murray and Ilya Samsonov?
I'd say so far so good, but the Leafs played 2 preseason games. They did one of these doubleheader style games on Saturday. Samsonov played and didn't allow a goal during his time in the net. I think he played 40 minutes. Matt Murray hasn't yet got into a preseason game, so we're not at a point where there's really much to judge on. But I suppose it's encouraging that Samsonov didn't go in and let in 5. That being said, I do think we have to be careful always with the preseason results, not just for goaltenders, skaters. I mean, so many of the veterans are going at like 60%. A guy used to tell me, who worked for a team, that he's always cautious of what he called September sweethearts. And that's the players that really wow in these early, stages of preseason, because his point is usually by October, November, December, we've forgotten that ever happened. So, it's obviously been a big talking point around Leafs training camp, just because, probably the most controversial set of decisions Kyle Dubas made is bringing in those 2 guys and for such a big season. And so how they fare will be debated. I'm sure we could get to a point where there's a debate about who's the number 1 and who should be number 2, those sorts of things, but they haven't really started yet. And, to put a point on that though, if you look back at the goalies that changed teams this summer, obviously, essentially, they chose these guys over giving Jack Campbell a 5-year deal. I think that was a term the Leafs really didn't want to consider going to with the guy that was their number 1 the last 2 seasons. Darcy Kemper goes to Washington, but there wasn't a lot of goalies that moved that I think were obviously better choices. But there's some risk at this position. There's lots of teams around the league right now that don't feel totally great about their number 1 or aren't 100% sure what they're going to get. That's not to say it won't blow up totally in everyone's face, but I think if you when any discussion about the Leafs goalies and the decisions made, the context has to be, it was a summer where there wasn't a lot of product out there if you needed a new number 1. And so Leafs have, I think, picked 2 guys that they hope that can platoon and so far there's no red alerts going off here yet, but it's still early in training camp.
Well, what would you say to people who take your point about the goalies and then say, well, even if there wasn't a lot, I mean, the Leafs found a way to get not 1 but 2 project goalies in the for their net, whereas some other teams, I mean, a team like Washington was able to get a Stanley Cup winning goalie in a Darcy Kemper. Jack Campbell, fine, he hasn't gone past the second round of the playoffs, but he's at least played in the playoffs. Matt Murray and Ilya Samsonov are question marks by comparison.
Well, I would say if you look at the Leafs last season, they ended up with 115 points. And for more than half the year, they were getting like 890 goaltending from their 2 guys. So they were winning 7 out of every 10 games, despite getting below average goaltending last year. And so I would say that, Ilya Samsonov's 25. He's a former first-round pick. Is it crazy that he could have a bounce season, that something could be unlocked here? I don't think that's a wild suggestion. And, Matt Murray's won those 2 Stanley Cups. He did have a stretch in Ottawa where he was very good. I think health has been a consistent issue for him. Again, no guarantees, but, the Leafs are banking on them to be average. I don't think anyone here is suggesting that they're going to unearth, an Igor Shesterkin or, something like that. I think that the clear plan was just to try to get someone that was good enough almost not to lose games. I mean, they still got a pretty strong team and a lot of offensive firepower. So, and the other part is that just because this is a decision to start camp, if it doesn't work, Kyle Dubas has been a GM that's been pretty good at addressing sort of issues, I would call them, in season. That's how Jack Campbell got there to begin with, shortly before the pandemic. So, there's I'm not necessarily defending it. I don't want it to come off that way, but I can understand how they got there. And I don't think it's, it's not crazy to say that they're like a 9-10. One of them is a 9-10, and maybe it's even better. I mean, Jack Campbell, had a pretty good long stretch of games at almost 920. If anything, last year was his most concerning season. He had a really long down period. They had to give him some time off during the season. He got it back together and was pretty good late in the year. But I could see why there's a shyness to give him 5 years when you've got a 2-year commitment here with Matt Murray and 1 year of Samsonov. I mean, there's an ability to pivot, I think, a little bit easier if these two guys aren't the answer.
Before we tear away from the Leafs, any update on Rasmus Sandin and his situation? We're pretty much going to be on Rasmus watch until something happens.
Yeah, I think we've entered a critical stage, actually, Julian, of these talks. It's as we record this on Monday morning. I think there's going to be a concerted effort here to get this thing across the finish line. The true deadline, if you want to look at it that way, is October 12th. That's when the season starts. That's when the cap hit starts being calculated for the Leafs. Won't go into the details, but essentially every day into the season before Rasmus Sandin was signed, it changes what his cap hit would be and basically makes it harder for the Leafs to accommodate a cap hit. So I think both sides would recognize getting a deal done at the absolute latest by the start of the season is the deadline. But we're still talking about a 22-year-old defenseman here, and he's one that I think the Leafs want to give the best opportunity to be ready for the season. So I think that there'll be a pretty strong push to get him back in camp, to get him to Toronto. He's in Sweden as of Monday morning, and have him on the ice with the team to practice, to play some preseason games, and obviously get some conditioning skates in. It's just, you can't replicate that, I don't think, truly on your own. So I would say look for some action there pretty soon. I don't have much more information in terms of exactly where the deals are at, more than I've said in the past on our pod, but I do still think it's going to be a short-term deal for Sandin, and I think there's a real push on to get him over to Toronto this week and get him skating in training camp.